My name is Elysia, and today at the Digital Debate Center, we're going to be talking about the World Health Organization Treaty Counterplan, which is for use against the pandemic affirmative. So to start off, let's just recap what a counterplan is. So instead of comparing the plan versus the status quo, which you might be used to doing with disadvantages, when you have a counterplan, you can compare the plan versus a world where you fixed whatever the affirmative harms are, with the benefit that you also did not trigger whatever the unintended consequences of doing the plan is. So it's like you get all the benefits of doing the AF without the drawbacks of the disadvantages happening. So a counterplan is something that you can use to tell the judge, hey, I've got a better option for you than the plan, even if you care about the affirmative harms more than anything else in this round. One thing to note about counterplans is that you should only introduce a counterplan when you have a net benefit to go with it. We'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about what a net benefit is, but in general, if there's not some drawback to doing the plan that the counterplan avoids, then you're not going to want to run the counterplan. So for the WHO counterplan that we're going to talk about, the net benefits are the disadvantages in the packet. So you have to read a counterplan along with a disadvantage. You're not going to just read a counterplan and not have any disadvantages. So just always make sure that you are not reading the WHO counterplan alone. So to break down kind of what the parts are that you should be having in that 1 and C when you choose to use a counterplan, there are three main things. The first thing is the text of the plan, which is just like the AF's plan text, except it's your policy action that you're going to do. So it's just like, this actor should do this action. The next part is a solvency advocate, which is just your solvency evidence about why you solved the affirmative harm. So it's very similar to how the 1AC has their solvency evidence about how the plan will fix their harm. This is you having the same thing where it's like, here's why our counterplan fixes their harms. And then the last part, the most unique part of the counterplan, is the net benefit, which is why doing the counterplan alone is preferable to doing the plan. Usually it's that you're going to avoid triggering some impact from a disadvantage. So again, for this one, the net benefits are avoiding the disadvantages, specifically the deterrence disadvantage and the public health disadvantage. So this together, all this together gives you something that you can say to the judge, hey, we're going to solve all of what the affirmative does, but we don't have to worry about the disadvantages. And making sure that we don't trigger those disadvantages is why you should care about, is why you should only want to do the counterplan and not include the plan. So let's talk about the WHO treaty counterplan specifically. The first part is the text of the card. So the counterplan itself is, the member states of the World Health Organization should sign and ratify a new international treaty for pandemic preparedness and response. You might notice that even though this isn't about funding like the affirmative plan, it is pretty similar, just using the World Health Organization instead of NATO as the actor. So as a quick note on the World Health Organization, or WHO, it is part of the United Nations. So one thing that makes it different from NATO, which has about 30 member states, is that it has 194 member states, because it's almost all of the UN members who are part of it. So let's talk about what the solvency advocates look like for this counterplan. There's two pieces of evidence. They're from the same source, the Bainimarama and others evidence, which the author itself, if you look at the site for the card, you'll see that there's a lot of names listed as part of that and others. So all of these people are essentially just a bunch of world leaders. So it's like, oh, the presidents of all these countries, the prime ministers, the chancellors, et cetera, of a bunch of different countries, essentially all coming together. So this source is actually directly from the World Health Organization, pretty much a bunch of the member states getting together and being like, this is what we think. So both your solvency advocate pieces of evidence are going to focus on that. So the first thing that we take from here, the first card we get from this, provides a lot of the details on what the treaty that the counterplan is advocating for could look like. And you'll notice that if you look at the details of what it is, a lot of it is very similar to what the 1AC evidence talks about when they're like, here's what NATO can do to do better. So stuff like sharing information, developing technology, and working together to come up with solutions, increasing access to medical supplies like tests and vaccines and PPE and all of that. So there's a big focus on the need for global cooperation specifically to address pandemics. So even though this piece of evidence doesn't directly compare the WHO and NATO, kind of the thing to think about if you're like, well, what makes this different from the affirmative solvency is just that the WHO is a much bigger, more global organization, and that there's a need for global cooperation versus just having like some countries just having, you know, like 30 relatively well-known countries. It's like there's a lot more countries out there, and we need to make sure that everyone is kind of working together in order to address pandemics because they are a worldwide issue. So the second piece of evidence specifically gets into how access to vaccines is an important part of fighting pandemics. So fighting pandemics requires that everyone be vaccinated. So for example, the article says that, you know, individual governments and multilateral organizations can't solve on their own. So that's kind of a direct criticism of things like, of plans where maybe it's just like, okay, the US alone will have a COVID response, or NATO will have a COVID response, or some other alliance or organization that kind of has some countries, but not trying to encompass as many countries as possible. So the focus is that kind of the nature of how fighting disease works, how pandemics work, how vaccination works is that it's not as effective unless everyone is protected. So making sure that everyone, no matter where they are in the world, has access to vaccines is super important. And this card specifically advocates for the WHO promoting that access to vaccines around the world. So if we look at just like the COVID numbers right now, we know that, like, you know, about 30% of the global population still isn't vaccinated against COVID. So even though a lot of countries are looking at it as like, okay, we're moving past COVID, we're getting past it, you know, it's not that big of a deal anymore. The reality is that it's not going to be over until the whole world has dealt with it. So this card is really bringing in the idea that in order to effectively deal with pandemics, we have to make sure everybody gets vaccinated. So the last thing to talk about is the net benefit. Now, there's technically two here. And an important thing to note is that this is not explicitly written out in your 1NC shell. So if you're looking at your packet, you're not going to see it written out as like net benefit, blah, 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 blah. So again, as a reminder, the net benefit here is solving the affirmative harms without triggering either of the disadvantages. So in your 1NC, you would be reading a disadvantage 1NC shell the way you're used to, either the deterrence, disad, or public health. You could do both, but you only need one per se. And then that is going to act as your net benefit. So if in cross-examination, the other team is like, what is the net benefit? You would explain that it is avoiding whichever disadvantage or disadvantages you read. And then the way you would talk about it is that in later speeches, your overviews about the counterplan would include a summary that makes clear that the net benefits are the disadvantages or is the single disadvantage. So again, you only want to talk about whichever disadvantage you actually read. So if you pick one, only talk about that one as the net benefit. If you are reading both, then you can say like, oh, look, we've got two net benefits here. But just to reiterate, our deterrence disadvantage, the whole idea is that the plan links because it takes NATO's focus away from their main goal of deterring Russia and keeping them from being aggressive to focus on public health. So if we have a counterplan where the WHO is doing things instead of NATO, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And then similarly, the public health disadvantage links to the affirmative because it gives militaries more power over a civilian issue, which is public health. And the counterplan doesn't do that because the WHO is not a military organization. So them getting more involved with pandemic preparedness or stepping up their efforts isn't going to do anything to kind of give militaries more power over public health or any other civilian spheres of influence. So the last thing I want to touch on, which is just about kind of all counterplans in particular, is the idea that you do not have to stick with one counterplan, with just having the counterplan and being like, okay, the status quo is no longer an option. So when you're negative, you have the freedom to get rid of the counterplan or kick it whenever you want. So the idea of running a counterplan is that it's the best case scenario where it's like, we don't have to worry about the affirmative harms. We don't have to worry about the disadvantages. We just get all of the benefits with none of the downsides. However, if you end up in a situation where maybe you're not winning the counterplan as easily and you just want to focus on the disadvantages, you can still do that. And you can still say, hey, listen, Judge, just like if you were in a regular disad debate where there was never a counterplan, doing nothing is still better than doing the plan because you're still going to avoid triggering those impacts. So you can say, okay, even if we don't solve the plan, or if we don't solve the affirmative harms, it's still better to do nothing than do the plan and risk triggering the disadvantage. So if you do decide to kick a counterplan, then you just tell the judge that you're kicking it or that you're no longer going for it in the speech where you decide this. Because again, you only need to win that either the status quo or the counter plan is better than the plan, not necessarily both. This idea that as the negative, you can kind of get rid of the counter plan whenever you want is called conditionality, which is something that we'll talk a bit more about in the answers, but conditionality is pretty much just, yes, this idea that the counter plan can go away and you can go back to just defending the status quo whenever you want. If you're wondering like, well, how do I know if I should kick the counter plan or not? It really varies by round. If you look at the JV curriculum on our website, you'll notice that it talks about kind of like strategically choosing arguments. Part of making strategic decisions is kind of like, how long will it take you to invest the time to win an argument? Like, do you think that based on the way the other side has answered it, so in this case, how the 2AC and the 1AR have answered these arguments, do you think it's something that you can easily win and convince the judge of, or is it something that you have to sink a lot of time into to maybe win? So when it would be too much of a time sink to go for that counter plan, that's when you want to kick it and just focus on the disadvantage. So another thing to kind of keep in mind here as you think about conditionality, regardless of what side you're on, is kind of like, is it fair or necessarily good for debate in terms of like what we learn and what we like work on knowing really well if the negative can just get rid of the counter plan at any time? Kind of, does conditionality seem like it lends itself to having debates where things are not significantly harder for the AF than the neg? Does it encourage the negative to actually learn the counter plan in detail, or does it kind of give them an easy out that allows for, you know, not putting in as much effort and getting more out of it? So these are just some things to think about as we move into the answering counter plans part of this lecture. All right, so now we're going to talk about what the answers to this counter plan can look like. So to start off with, there's various ways that we can answer counter plans, both by kind of punching holes in the arguments that the negative has set up, similar to how the negative can make arguments against the AF case. We can kind of make arguments of the same nature against whatever the neg's plan is and say like, okay, you know what, there's actually a lot of holes in this. And then there's also some things very unique to counter plans that we can do in order to kind of tell the judge, it's like, hey, this is not something that's worth voting on. So the acronym that we can use to remember some of the strategies for answering counter plans is PLOTS. So I want to stress that these are all options for things to do against a counter plan, but it's not that you have to do all of these things, or even that, you know, you should do all of these things for a given counter plan. So to start off with, we have the permutation, which you might also hear referred to as perm. This is probably going to be your most important tool against the counter plan. This is where you tell the judge, listen, the counter plan and the plan are not mutually exclusive. That is the key phrase, that they are not mutually exclusive. So we can do both, because the negative's goal is to get the judge not to vote to do the plan. If you're AF, you just need to get the judge to agree to do the plan. Even if they're also doing the counter plan, that is still a win for you. So the permutation, which you'll often hear phrased as permutation, do both, is pretty much just saying like, yeah, let's just have both, because that's entirely possible. The second thing is links to the net benefit. So if you can prove that either the counter plan does actually trigger whatever the net benefit is, that's something that makes it so that there's no longer anything that makes the counter plan better than the plan. So if everyone's going to trigger the disad, it's kind of like, well, what's the point of the counter plan? So arguing that it does actually link to the net benefit, or arguing that, you know, your plan doesn't actually link to the net benefit, also makes it so that there's not a big advantage over there's not a big advantage of doing the counter plan over doing the plan. So either making it so somehow you have to make it so that these net benefits, which again are typically going to be disadvantages, are something that shouldn't really factor into the judge's decision making. So either everyone's going to cause the disadvantages or no one's going to cause the disadvantages is one way to think about this. And this is not something that you'll see highlighted in the packet as like no link to the net benefit. This is something that kind of you articulate the same way that you will be making arguments against whatever the disadvantages are. You would kind of on the counterplan flow just point that out and say, hey, if we win that we don't link to this disadvantage, then you should not worry about the net benefit because there isn't one anymore. The next thing is offense. So the same way a disadvantage is something that says, hey, here are bad things that happen from doing the plan, you can pretty much have a disadvantage against a counter plan when you're at. So you could say, hey, here is a disadvantage to doing the counter plan. Say pretty much the counter plan would cause these bad things to happen. So yeah, you can really just flip the script and tackle this just like the negative comes for the affirmative with disadvantages. So if there's any reasons you could come up with for why doing the counter plan itself will cause something bad, you can introduce those as a reason that doing the counter plan is bad and doing the plan is a preferable way to solve the affirmative's harms. The fourth thing, and I really don't want y'all to get too bogged down in this, is theory. Theory arguments kind of get into not like the actual arguments and like what they're saying, but more are about kind of like which arguments are kind of good or bad for debate as an activity. So theory arguments would say kind of, oh, the kinds of arguments that the other side has made are bad for debate in some way, usually that they are bad for education or bad for fairness. So the arguments that they've run for some reason, either like, you know, don't promote good education, they don't encourage us to like learn a bunch about the topic or our arguments, or they're bad for fairness. So they make it so that it's kind of like, you know, we are less invested in this activity because it just doesn't feel fair. It feels like you're putting in a lot of work, a lot more work if you're on one side than the other, is one way to think about it. So the impacts to theory arguments are more about kind of like, what does having this kind of argument do to debate as a whole activity? How does it make us feel about what we're getting out of it by participating in it as debaters? So the main theory argument that you'll see against counterplans is usually conditionality. So earlier when we talked about how the negative can just get rid of the counterplan at any point, that is something that is really easy to criticize, where it's like, hey, that's not good for education, because think of all of the reasons why the negative just getting to have an argument, you make a bunch of arguments against it, and then they just say, never mind, and then go back to just talking about the disadvantage, and they didn't, you know, it was a very easy trade-off for them. So you have to invest time as the affirmative to answer the counter plan, but the negative can very easily just say, okay, we're done with it. And think about like all of the reasons why that is not fair to you as the affirmative, and reasons why it's not very educational overall for all of us if the negative can just throw away a counter plan when it's inconvenient for them. So theory arguments, again, absolutely not something that you have to do, but something that you can do. Typically, you introduce it to the judge by setting it up as kind of an interpretation where you say, hey, here's how it should be, a violation where you say the other team is not meeting our interpretation, and then you give them standards, which are the education and fairness things of like, these are the things that happen that are bad for debate, and then kind of you tell them what the punishment for that should be. So often teams might say, okay, well, they should lose. It's a voting issue, so you should vote against the other team because they did this thing that is bad for debate. But it might also be just that you're like, hey, you know, you should not weigh the counter plan very heavily, or, you know, they shouldn't get as many speaker points or something. So it does not have to be that the other team should lose, but it's pretty much something that says this is not a very good argument, and judge, you should not actively want to vote for this in a way. So an interpretation might just be that the negative should not have any conditional advocacies. They do. That's bad for. Give your list of reasons why it's bad for education and or fairness, and then tell the judge what you think the punishment for that should be. And then that's something to just try if you want to, but again, you don't have to do it. And then the last thing is solvency, specifically solvency deficits. So just like the negative, when talking about the AF case, can be like, you don't actually solve your harms. You can do the same thing. You can say, hey, the counterplan doesn't actually solve the AF harms. Like there's a bunch of holes that we can poke in their logic of how this solves. And if they're not solving the affirmative, then there's not a reason to prefer them. So let's look at what the 2AC in the packet for the WHO counterplan actually looks like. So the first thing is a permutation argument. It's from Voss and others in 2022. So this card essentially says that it's better that not only can we have both, but we should have both the plan and the counterplan, because just doing the counterplan alone, just having a treaty from the WHO would take a long time, and we have to actually do things in the meantime to make sure that pandemics don't happen, that outbreaks don't turn into pandemics. And it's pretty much just like, yeah, a treaty is not like a one-size-fits-all, one-stop-shop solution. But it does point out that there are things that are helpful about having a treaty. So the idea of this argument is that the best case scenario is to both have NATO actively work on that pandemic readiness, make sure that those outbreaks don't turn into pandemics, but also have the WHO do their treaty, have countries work on building trust and their infrastructure and stuff. Just do both, because just doing a treaty really is not enough to solve, but doing both together is very beneficial. So the rest of the arguments in the 2AC shell are solvency deficit arguments. So there's 3 different arguments that are all kind of just like, okay, well, this is why doing the counterplan alone will not work. It will not solve the affirmative harms. So the first card is also from Voss and others. This one talks about how and why WHO treaties can't actually stop pandemics. So it specifically talks about how there are issues. The WHO uses international health regulations, or IHR, in order to kind of try to fight things like pandemics. And there's a bunch of things that make these ineffective overall. So the card talks about contraventions, which just think about these as things that were working against the WHO and their goal to actually stop pandemics. So things that were working against the WHO when they tried to use international health regulations to prevent a pandemic included things like other countries not actually sharing any information about outbreaks, having their own policies and being like, we're going to do these things, even though the WHO never recommended them. And then when the WHO did recommend things, they just a bunch of member states didn't do them. So the idea is that, even though there are a bunch of member states in the WHO, they're not actually willing to do what is needed for the WHO to be effective. So it relies on the countries actually doing the things that they recommend, actually working together, actively collaborating in order to be effective at both detecting and responding to things like pandemics. And other countries are kind of just like, I don't feel like doing that. So that makes them overall very ineffective. The second solvency deficit card from Good in 2021 talks about how if we just look at COVID specifically, the WHO really just fumbled it. So there's 3 things that the card talks about as having been why it was so hard. One is just that it was too hard. The cost was too high for them to officially designate it as an emergency as it was happening. It talks about the overall structure of the WHO itself, which the second card will also get into more about kind of how the nature of the WHO doesn't really make it that effective. And then how they really focused on countries being able to respond to things, but not necessarily actually being willing to do the things they needed to do. So imagine if everyone had all the equipment, all the gear they needed, everyone was ready to go, but then they're just sitting on their hands and they're like, well, I'm not actually going to do anything with this. And that's kind of what happened. So this card and the second one actually talk about how in 2002 and 2003, there was a SARS outbreak that was similarly fumbled. And this is kind of just a repeat of that, where the WHO is just really ineffective at handling outbreaks. And the other name for COVID-19 is actually SARS-CoV-2. So we can see it's they failed with SARS then, they failed with SARS now. It's just that it ended up being way worse now than it was back in 2002 and 2003. But overall, the WHO has a really bad track record of actually responding to things. And then the final piece of evidence in the 2AC shell talks about how the WHO really does not have any power to make people do anything. So if we look about the last slide and how countries can pretty much just be like, wouldn't you want to know, weather boy? There's nothing stopping countries from just being like, no, at the WHO. They pretty much can only rely on shaming people, shaming countries, being like, oh, these countries are not doing what we asked them to do, and isn't that bad? And if that is not enough to get countries to actually adopt whatever practices they're trying to encourage or recommend, then it's just there's nothing else they can really do. So the fact that shaming is like a thing that happens retroactively. So you can only start shaming people after they've already failed to do something you wanted them to do. So that doesn't really help with pandemic prevention. So if we're already in a pandemic because people didn't do what they were supposed to do, shaming them isn't really going to help us fix things after the fact. So the WHO is really ineffective at actually like preventing countries from doing anything, and their one tactic for trying to get countries to actually do something also is just, yeah, it's just social pressure, and that's not the most powerful thing. So these are the overall arguments against the WHO counterplan. You can also try to incorporate some of the other ideas from plots, but this is what's in the packet. So I hope this video was helpful, and we'll see you at the next DDC.